Technical stuff all fired up here. All right, good evening. Steve was away speaking again this evening, so I've been pressed into service. If you open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 7, I believe it's lesson 10 on your syllabus. And that has us in Daniel chapters 7 and 8. So thank you for coming tonight. First verse of chapter 7. It says that we're in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Now, you've already covered the opening chapters of Daniel, and we were introduced to Belshazzar in chapter 5, and that was at the end of his reign when he saw that writing on the wall, and he was told that pretty much it's over for you, and he was slain that evening, the way chapter 5 concluded. So we'll jump in our study tonight. We're in, of course, this period here in our curriculum at Eastside. These three periods of the 17 occur in the captivity, return from captivity, and then the years of silence. This is the map that you've been shown all throughout the quarter. The three prophets God's primarily using at this time. Jeremiah stayed in Judah or Jerusalem. Ezekiel went into Babylon by the river Kibar among the exiles, and Daniel was the first to go, and he was chosen by Nebuchadnezzar, along with other promising youths to serve him in his palace. So, just to sort of set the framework of where we are now in the book of Daniel versus where you've been, the first 6 chapters are well known even to the children. That's where all the good stories are. Daniel purposing in his heart not to defile himself, chapter 1, the statue in chapter 2, Daniel's 3 friends in the fiery furnace, chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar's other dream, his vision, being humble, chapter 4. As we said a moment ago, Belshazzar, seeing the writing on the wall, chapter 5, and then the lion's den story with Daniel as an older man, probably in his 80s, where we conclude. That finished up chapter 6. So this half of the book of Daniel is focused on historical events, well-known stories, and Daniel and his friends are the main characters, either one or all of them in each of those chapters. The king of Babylon, or the kings of Babylon, are shown in one way or another that you really are subject to the king of all. The God of heaven rules in the affairs of all men. And that's been shown in numerous ways throughout those opening chapters. The wise men that the Babylonian monarchs would rely on for wisdom and for information, they're shown to be of little help. They didn't have any wisdom. The wisdom of God through his prophet Daniel was, of course, far superior to anything they could come up with. And interestingly, the opening 6 chapters are written in the third person, and God is speaking through historical events. Again, all these well-known stories. The back half of the book is quite the opposite, or I shouldn't say opposite, it's just different. These are chapters that deal with visions and prayers, things that are shown through inspiration. These chapters are usually less studied than the familiar stories in Daniel. I'm not indicting anybody. I'm just saying that's just as a matter of opinion. The friends of Daniel disappear. We don't read them anymore. And Daniel, instead of being active in these events that happen in his life, he's now an instrument of inspiration, if you will, or revelation. God's going to make things known through Daniel to the king or to others. The monarchs, the Babylonian kings, or by this time it's the other kings that Daniel served, the Medes and the Persians. They're only mentioned, not in terms of, again, reading a story, but they're mentioned just as giving us points of history, or a timeline, if you will, for dating. The Babylonian wise men, they're not mentioned at all. We don't read of them anymore. And it's written in the first person rather than the third person. And God is speaking not through history, but through prophecy. So that's a good way to sort of encapsulate the book as a whole, sort of like a helicopter view. This half is phrased this way, and this half is phrased that way. Remember now the book's theme, you've probably been hammering this for the past 2 or 3 lessons, is that the nations of men, the kingdoms of men, are always subject to God's sovereign rule. God's overall, just like He is today. That's not changed, obviously. But even in these very ancient stories, that was im- impressed more than once. Again, historically, the first 6 chapters, and then prophetically, the last 6 chapters. So again, you have this contrast between the true God, the living God, and the false deities of the pagans, and this would give God's people some comfort because again, what are they in the midst of? Even by now, they're toward the back end of what time period, which lasted 70 years. So they're just about through it. They're through the better part of it anyway. They're not right at the end, but they're closer than they were when they went into captivity, obviously. And so they need some encouragement, some continuing comfort that you still need to serve God. God's going to bring all this to an end, and of course He did. And God's word never fails. If He said it's going to last 70 years, then it's just going to last 70 years. You just need to trust God. So all that being said, just by way of introduction, the book of Daniel is it's a bilingual book, and it's not even in a sequence, if you please. The first chapter through the second chapter, and then a break in here, that's in Aramaic, and then you have back in chapter 8 through the end of the book is written in Hebrew. Bible commentators, others who are more of an expert than most of us are in linguistics, will say there's no real rhyme or reason why that's so. That's just how it was written. So, but there may be some logic to it if you think about it. Aramaic was the international language of the 6th century in BC. Well, is the kingdom of Judah the only real kingdom that's being on the stage here? Well, there are other peoples, obviously. So it's bringing in other people to know the will of God, and it's quite plausible, but that's why it was inspired in that language, so that they could understand the overall message as well, that the God of the Hebrews, He is sovereign of the universe, and He rules, He reigns, and all peoples are subject to Him. So I can't prove that's the case, but that at least that makes sense to me. So Aramaic used in portions of the book dealing with the Gentile kingdoms in the future, and then Hebrew used in the portions of the book that deal primarily with the events as they were unfolding, both historically and prophetically, with God's people and their future. All right, so these opening slides were prepared just to kind of give us an idea of an overall view of the book. One thing I want us to not lose sight of tonight is, as I want you to think all throughout class tonight, especially when we discuss chapter 7, there is a direct correlation between chapter 2 and chapter 7. If you know chapter 2, which was the story of what? And the statue, the 4 different parts of the statue. If you know that, and most of us know that story, then you'll get chapter 7. It's really the same story, just told from a different perspective. So let's not lose sight of chapter 2 and make the comparison to chapter 7. So here we have that Nebuchadnezzar saw 4 world empires, starting with himself. He was the head of gold, then the silver, and then the bronze, and the iron mixed with clay. The perspective of that statue was from the outside, looking at it from the outside. Its glory, if you will, the worth or the power of the metals as they represented certain kingdoms that would succeed him on the world stage of politics, if you will. That being the case. But now chapter 7 is a different perspective. It's the same 4 kingdoms that Daniel saw, but now the perspective was inward character, not outside, but inward. And rather than 4 metals, it was 4 beasts who were vicious and consuming, who would come along and conquer peoples, not in a humane way either. But again, the overall message, they really parallel. So again, just keep in mind, chapter 2, chapter 7, they really are almost like hand in glove. They really go well together. All right, so now focusing on chapter 7, which is where we start tonight. We have the vision of the 4 beasts. Again, this is the succession of the 4 world empires, and we're going to end up with the same as the statue ended up. That would be the Roman Empire. So we'll end with that in the vision here. Again, very similar to Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We're going to read a couple of passages there on the last bullet point, Acts chapter 1 and chapter 2. Make some other references to the passages there in the Revelation. All right, so let's look now at chapter 7 of the book of Daniel. Let's read a few verses. Daniel 7, beginning in verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts were coming up from the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had the wings of an eagle. I kept looking until its wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind or heart was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear. And it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. And thus they said to it, Arise, devour much flesh or meat. After this I kept looking, and behold, another one like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And after this I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying, and extremely strong, and it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed, and trampled down the remainder with its feet, and it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boast. And we'll stop right there. So here's the dream. Not a ordinary dream that people have. Very terrifying, odd thing. So this is seen in his first year. This is Belshazzar's first year. Again, we were introduced to this king in chapter 5. That would be at the end of his reign. This is now, of course, when he would begin reign. And this is the same Belshazzar, as we said, this is the same as the Nebuchadnezzar dream in chapter 2, but has different images. And the 4th beast is judged and destroyed. Okay, here's the beasts, if you will. The first one was like a lion, but it had wings, eagle's wings. That's in verse 4. The second beast was like a bear. What was in its mouth? Ribs would indicate it was a devouring beast, consumed things, raised up on its side, was told to arise and devour much meat. The third was a leopard. Any significance to it having 4 wings? 4 fowl's wings and 4 heads. Is that meaningful? Well, it is. Again, keep in mind the parallel to chapter 2. And we'll tie it all together just in a moment. The 4th beast was extremely or exceedingly dreadful, terrible beast, iron teeth, brass nails, 10 horns, and a little horn that came up and plucked out 3 other horns. So there's verse 4, 5, 6, and 7, and 8. Now, the first beast, the lion, would symbolize who? Babylon. That's correct. Just like the head of gold did in the statue. It's the same 4 kingdoms. Okay? The second beast, this one here, the bear, would symbolize who? Who was next? The Medo-Persian coalition. Because they're the ones under Cyrus who came and they finally defeated Babylon. Babylon had defeated Assyria, then they were ruling, and then now here's the Medes and the Persians. Okay? The third beast was the leopard that had the 4 fowl's wings, or the 4 wings and the 4 heads. Who was next on the world stage? That'd be the Greeks or the Macedons. All right? So it's Greece. And then, obviously, who's the last one? That would be Rome. So again, the parallel is not accidental. This is by divine design that Daniel see this. Teaching the same lesson. The succession of these worldly empires. Okay, now we stopped in verse 8. Let's pick up now in verse 9, and we'll read a few more verses. Daniel kept looking, he writes, until the thrones were set up and the Ancient of Days took his seat. Who's the Ancient of Days? That be God. Any significance to the title Ancient of Days? He's without limits of time. He's before time. He's not subject to time. He's ancient as you can get. He's not bound by time. So the Ancient of Days took his seat. His vesture was like white snow, the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames. Its wheels were a burning fire. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him, and the court sat, and the books were open. Then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the horn, that's in verse 11, which is this, let me go back. That would be this beast here, the little horn that came up. He mentions this horn, which the horn was speaking, and I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away. Each kingdom only lasts for a certain while, and then they lose that dominion, and the next one takes its place. But an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. So these kingdoms, they have dominion, glory, and kingdom. And now we're in verse 13. This is an important section of chapter 7. So Daniel sees the Ancient of Days being seated in his court upon his throne, all the servants about him. Now verse 13. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. Who do you think this is? This is Christ. He came up to the Ancient of Days, that'd be his Father, and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. What's the kingdom? That'd be the church. The prophesied kingdom, the messianic kingdom, that's been talked about by other prophets before Daniel. So let's pause right here. Hold your place here. Turn now to Acts chapter 1. Let's go there just for a moment. Well-known passage, Acts chapter 1. What's about to happen here in Acts chapter 1 before we get to chapter 2? The ascension of Christ. And we're going to link Acts 1 and Daniel 7 together. Look now at Acts 1. Jesus has finished giving his instructions at the end of verse 8. He's through talking. Now Luke writes this. After he said these things, there's Christ on the screen there. After he said these things, he was lifted up while they were looking on. So he's talking, and where's Jesus go? He ascends up into the clouds. They ever see him anymore? He's left the earth. He's gone. They kept looking, right? Here come the angels and basically say what to the apostles? Why are you looking? Why are you staring? If it had been me, my mouth would be hanging wide open, I'm sure. It's like, I can't believe I saw that. So why are you looking like this? He's going to come back the way he left. And that's through verse 11. Now that's the end of the human or earthly perspective, isn't it? They could see past the clouds. But go back down to Daniel 7. We began reading in verse 13. And Daniel now sees by revelation this vision. Where does the Son of Man come from to the Ancient of Days? Out of the clouds. This is the other side of the clouds. You see that? And behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a Son of Man came. He was presented to the Ancient of Days. So this is the complete picture. When Jesus left the earth, that's Acts chapter 1. But when he got through the clouds and went to his eternal heavenly reward for being faithful to his Father, this is what Daniel's prophesying. This is the complete picture. And at that point, Jesus was enthroned. He now has dominion. And the kingdom is about ready to be established on the earth, isn't it? Because back in Acts chapter 2, what happens? The first gospel sermon is preached. And men and women are added to it by their obedience to the gospel. Baptized into Christ. And the Lord added to the church, the kingdom, such as should be saved. So that's how you get the complete picture. So here you have this prophecy. Over 500 years before it happened, Daniel is telling us this was always in the plan, the mind of God. This is a tremendously magnificent sight to think about, this prophecy. And Daniel shows us that. Look at Hebrews chapter 1 with me in verse 8, just real quickly. Hebrews, Steve had these verses on the slides. Hebrews 1 and verse 8. In the arguments in the opening chapter of Hebrews, it's proving the divinity or the divine nature of Christ. Chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2 and verse 4. All about the deity of Christ. Hebrews 1 and verse 8. The writer says that the angels are made servants or ministers. That's verse 7. But of the Son, he says, what? Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the righteous scepter is the scepter of the kingdom. Who holds the scepter? Well, a king does. So Christ has now been given his kingdom. And that's prophetically promised here through the inspiration to Daniel. So Daniel sees all this. Now back to Daniel 7. Look at verse 15. What was his initial reaction? What would have been your reaction? You see these beasts and you see all this other stuff. He was grieved and troubled. He didn't know what to think about it. Just from a human standpoint, I mean, he's an inspired man, but he didn't know what to make of all this. So he was grieved. My version says, and my spirit was distressed within me. And the visions in my mind kept alarming me. So Daniel does what most people would do. Verse 16, I approached one of those who were standing by and asked, what does all this mean? Well, he's not going to be told what the meaning of all these things are. Starting now in verse 17. The beast are the four kings which come out of the earth, and they will follow in succession in an orderly fashion, just like he had told Nebuchadnezzar years before, based on that king's dream of the statue, the four parts of it. This is the same message. Babylon is fixing to be done away with, and they'll be replaced by the Medo-Persian coalition led by Cyrus. What part will Cyrus play in the end of the 70-year captivity? He's going to say, you're done. The captivity's over. Not just the people of Judah, but all nations who Babylon had conquered. Everyone go back to your homeland. Build your temples, pray to your gods, on and on and on. But he ended that. Well, then Cyrus dies, and who defeats the Persians? Well, the Medo-Persians. It'd be the Greeks, led by Alexander. Talk about him just in a moment. And then he didn't last very long. What happened to his kingdom? Divided up among four generals. Why did that beast have 4 wings and 4 heads? See, it's prophetic. Daniel's been given all this information. It's just falling in line, just with great specificity. Who alone but God would know all that? Nobody. Daniel certainly didn't know it of his own, but he's being told by inspiration. And then following that was the last kingdom to come along. The bottom of the statue, the last beast in Daniel 7. It would be the Romans. Back in chapter 2, Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar, in the days of those kings, what would God do? Set up a kingdom that would never be destroyed nor left to another people. What's that kingdom? It's the church. So again, you see it's just hand in glove. It's very, very similar. Meant to be on purpose. So Daniel was told all these things. So he wanted to understand the truth about the fourth beast, which was dreadful and destructive. Maybe amongst all 4 of them, the most dreadful and destructive. And he's asking questions about that. So one of its horns grew great, spoke pompous words. That's in verse 21 of chapter 7. And successfully made war against the saints. Did the Romans do that? Did they persecute the Christians? Absolutely. And to great degree. But verse 22 of chapter 7, the Ancient of Days made judgment against it, and the kingdom was given to the saints. So who eventually is going to win in the end? It would be the Son of Man, this Messianic kingdom, and his saints, his citizens, will be victorious over even the destructive fourth beast in the end. So the fourth beast is the fourth kingdom. And the 10 horns are 10 kings. Now there's great debate as to when do you start counting the Caesars. This isn't a class on Revelation anyway, but the point is, prophetically, this was all spoken. And the other horn would arise and subdue 3 of those kings. And they would speak great words against the saints. They would persecute them for time, times, and half a time. That's a very important phrase in prophecy, especially in the Revelation. Time, times, and 3.5. That's for a limited period of time. Daniel uses that phrase, and so does John in the Revelation. So jumping back now in chapter 7, look at verse 26. The court of heaven would take dominion away from this oppressing king, this one horn that came out of those 10 and subdued 3. The saints of the Most High would then possess an everlasting kingdom. That's the church. Just trying to keep it all basic and simple here. And then Daniel was greatly troubled by all this, and his countenance was changed. Verse 28. At this point, the revelation ended. So Daniel has seen the whole vision. And as for me, Daniel, my thoughts were greatly alarming me, and my face grew pale. But he decided to do what? As the chapter concludes, I'm going to keep it to myself. I'm just going to internalize all this and mull it over in my mind and try to understand what God was showing me through these visions. Okay. So again, Steve wants to take just a moment and notice the similarities between Daniel's fourth beast that came out of the sea and the sea beast and John's vision, which is in the Revelation chapter 13. So here's again this phrase that's prophetically important. Time, times, and half a time, which is 3.5. Sometimes it's listed as 42 months. That's the same. Sometimes it's listed as 1260 days. That's all the same time right there. That's referring to this limited time that God allowed those who would oppress this promised kingdom, but it would be ended at some point in time. Time, times, and half a time. So again, that's a prevalent number in the book of Revelation. There's the passages there on that little chart right there. Okay, so there's other verses from the Revelation. Great similarity. Came from the sea. Similar appearances. Spoke with oppressive words out of their mouth. Horns. Conflicted with the saints, and they would be judged by the Ancient of Days. Very, very similar messages. Okay. Anything through chapter 7 before we get to chapter 8? Yes, Lorenzo.
Two things. One thing you said is the comparison between chapter 3 and chapter 7 is the outside versus the I have also heard it said that it's the way that men look at it versus the way that God looks at it.
Mm-hmm.
And you see just how different it is.
Yes.
Then another thing is the section chapters 2 to 7 they mirror each other. Chapter 2 is verse chapter 7, 3 and 6, 4 and 5.
Yes.
So in 2 and 7 you have God rules over history and will bring about his purpose. Chapter 3 and 6 you have God who will take care of his people. And then chapter 4 and 5 is God humbles the proud.
Yes.
Which is what is very relevant to the captives right
Absolutely.
now. Both because they're paying for it and because they're going to eventually get out of it.
Yes. And none of that's by accident. That's all in the mind of God. Those are very good observations to keep in mind. Just looking at it from a big picture wise, that's a good way to summarize these chapters in the book of Daniel. Okay. Let's go to chapter 8 now. And more visions. And now this is a specified vision or dream, if you will. The vision we just looked at and talked about in chapter 7 was big picture wise. It's the succession of all the worldly empires on the stage of history, one after another. This is specifically looking at one of the beasts, and it's who? It's the Greeks, the Macedons, again led by Alexander the Great. So you have the vision of the ram and the goat. Now, jumping ahead just real quickly, look at verse 20. We'll go back up and read the verses we're skipping. But who is the ram? We're told. It's the Medes and the Persians, that coalition. Look at verse 21. Who's the goat? That's Greece. That's Alexander. So we don't have to guess who these beasts are. We're told in the vision that's exactly who they represent. All right. So notice these passages back in chapter 2. Remember, Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar, "You, O king, are the head of gold." He told him, "You're the top of the statue." So that was no dispute. Again, here in chapter 5 and chapter 8, the Medo-Persian coalition, they're identified specifically. Greece is identified in the verse we just looked at, chapter 8 and verse 21. So the overarching truth in all of these is that God is sovereign. And He always promised, always planned, I'll let men have their time on the world stage. And He did. But what's eventually going to come? I'm going to set up my kingdom. That stone that was cut without hands in chapter 2 hit the earth and became a mountain and filled the whole earth. That's His kingdom. Is God ruling any less today in the kingdoms of men than He was back then? I don't want to drag the election into this because we're all tired of hearing about it, but who's going to win the election? And don't give me a name. Whoever God picks, that's right. God will raise that ruler up. That's what He's always done in all the kingdoms of men. And we'll get who He thinks we need. Now, we may have an opinion about that, and that's okay. But that's really the truth about it. So God ruled in these kingdoms. God rules in our national affairs today, just the exact same way. And now we're going to look at specifically this third kingdom in this quartet, if you will, the Greeks, as they would come upon the world stage here. So Alexander the Great. Let's read a few verses before we look at this. Slide. Chapter 8 now, verse 1. This is now the third year of Belshazzar. So, again, chapter 7 was in his first year. This is 2 years later. And again, all this is happening before chapter 5, which was at the end of his life. In the third year of the reign of Belshazzar the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me, which is chapter 7 previously. And I looked in the vision, and it came about while I was looking that I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai canal. Then I lifted my gaze and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. But one was longer than the other, with the longer coming up last. What would be the reason for having 2 horns? If this is the Medes and Persians, it's the coalition. And one's longer because it's the dominant partner in this coalition, which would be the Persians. Now, verse 3. Verse 4. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward. No other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power, but he did as he pleased and magnified himself. While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. I get that to mean with speed or haste. This marching force, this army of Alexander was coming. And he had a conspicuous horn between his eyes, came up to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. And I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns. So what did Alexander do with his Greek forces? He defeated the Medo-Persian coalition. Defeated them. And that's what's being talked about in this dream. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly. That's Alexander. But as soon as he was mighty, and this didn't take long, the large horn was broken. And in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. What are those 4 horns? Did he die a young age or an old age? He died young. What happened to his kingdom? It was divvied up among 4 generals, historically. And so we're getting closer and closer to now how this is going to play out in the affairs of the years of silence that we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about the rest of this quarter. So here's Alexander the Great. Just historically, some information. He received support from 7,000 troops under Sanballat, related to the Jewish high priest by marriage. And he was good to the Jews, basically. He allowed them to continue their religion, and he exempted them from tribute every seventh year. So he wasn't a terribly oppressive leader in terms of how others would have been. He was somewhat kind, and so was Cyrus too, really. Compared to Nebuchadnezzar and the Assyrians, they were pretty good rulers, just from that standpoint. There's great evidence that this was written before. The Bible always has its critics. Well, this is too specific to have been written before. Well, again, Daniel couldn't have known this, but who did know it? God knew this. And by inspiration, he's telling Daniel these specifics. All right, so here's this dream. And when the book of Daniel was showed to Alexander, this is by Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, there's the reference. He was shown this when Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the temple or the empire of the Persians. He surmised he's talking about me. So again, historically, he was shown this information. And he died at a young age. Again, that's proven historically. And the kingdom was divided among his four princes or generals: Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, and Lysimachus. And again, that's proven historically. That's outside the Scripture. We don't have their names in this chapter, but that's a matter of record in the history or the annals of history. So here's the Greek Empire, if you will, and it's all been divided among these four generals. And you'll see the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. They will be of particular note among God's people in this area. They'll have great influence over the remnant when they finally get to go back home from captivity. And we'll talk about them more later on. So again, this fulfills the prophecy in Daniel that the empire was divided among his generals. So about the year 165, this is now toward the end of Daniel 8 here, you'll hear this name quite a bit, Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a ruthless leader. He greatly persecuted God's people, desecrated the restored temple, even sacrificed swine upon the altar, which to a Jew, what is that? That's terrible, completely terrible. And again, we'll talk about him, or you'll talk about him in future classes. He was of the Seleucid region, if you will, and that, of course, led about to the Maccabean revolt, which again takes place in the years of silence among God's people. So we went through chapter 8 rather hurriedly, but you get the main idea. That's what's going on. So applications. I want to end with this passage in Isaiah chapter 46 there on your chart. Turn to Isaiah 46 real quick before the last bell gets us, and see if this doesn't make sense with what Isaiah said before all this happened. Isaiah 46 and the last part of verse 9 through verse 10. This is God speaking. Remember the former things long past, for I am God, and there is no other like me. I am God, there's no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things which should not have been done. How did Daniel come to learn all this we went through hurriedly tonight? Who knew all this? God did. God did. And as a matter of fact, in chapter 44 of Isaiah's prophecy, who is mentioned by name that would release the Jews from captivity? Cyrus. And that was spoken about 150 years before he was even born. How can Isaiah have known that? Well, he couldn't have known that, but God certainly did. So again, God knows all this and was relaying all this information to his prophets. And tonight's lesson were these two very important chapters in Daniel's visions to let God's people know, look, God's in control. God's going to allow these kingdoms to come one after the other, but really, God's over all of it. And don't lose heart of that. What's the lesson to us? Who's in control today? God's in control. And we just got to trust him. We got to trust him. We may be like Daniel. We may be troubled by things as they happen. Well, that's just us being human. But we can trust God. He'll take care of it in a way that needs to be taken care of. All right. Thank you for your attention tonight. You'll resume with chapter or lesson 11 on Sunday morning, the Lord willing.
Good evening. When I was a boy, a young man, as many of you know because many of you have known me since I was a very small child, I was a little bit of a rebel. I did not have great respect for authority, and I believed I knew everything there was to know. Well, as years went by, I finished school, started working, started sustaining myself, and then eventually sustaining my family. And I've gained a lot of new perspective since then. And now, having a little rebellious child of my own, I have greatly new perspective. I have much more value and authority now. At some point along the line, I made this realization. Actually, I don't know anything, let alone everything. There's a really famous model or graph really, shows this exact phenomenon. You might have seen it before. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's often used in business to kind of describe a person's confidence level, a pattern they typically follow for their career, but I think it can easily be kind of blown out into a broader view for our whole lives. Like I said, it graphs a line of one's self-confidence as they gain more knowledge and more wisdom and more experience throughout their lives. When we're young, we're soaking up all this information, we learn new things, and we might gain a lot of self-confidence really quickly and believe that we're on the mountaintop, that we know everything there is to know. This is called the child's hill, or the mountain of ignorance. This is usually the place where people make really big mistakes, do really dumb things. You see a lot of arrogance on Child's Hill. For instance, the prodigal son was definitely up on Child's Hill whenever he went to his father and demanded his inheritance and left home. Some people never make it off of this hill. They live their entire lives in ignorant bliss. They don't think they need to learn anymore, so they don't. And they're happy where they are to their demise. And some others will usually make fools of themselves and end up on the next point of the graph, the valley of despair. This is where people go when they realize they actually don't know anything and they don't have all the answers. This is the prodigal son's moment in the pig pen. From here, there's 3 places you can go. You can either try to climb back up your mountain of false confidence, like a dog returning to its vomit. Proverbs 26:11 says that, like a fool repeating his folly. Or you can just wallow in your depression and never really grow. You just accept the fact that you don't know anything and never go anywhere. Or you can face the situation with humility and climb up the slope and grow towards enlightenment. The prodigal son was humbled, and he humbled himself in order to return to his father's house to hopefully become a servant of his. That's when he began his that's when he began his climb out of the valley of despair up the slope of enlightenment. It takes a long time to reach the plateau of sustainability, as they call it. But putting our confidence in God is really the only way we can get up that slope. 1 Corinthians 13:11 and 12 says, "When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know just as I also am known." We only know in part now. The most we can hope for on earth is to know in part, about as much as you can learn from a dim reflection. But the time will come when we will know completely, just as God knows us completely. It's when we will see him face to face. Until then, we have just a few instructions on how we should live now. And it's in the next verse. Verse 13. Now abide faith, hope, love, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Without these things, we cannot hope to climb out of the valley of despair. And without them, we will not see God. When you examine your own life, where do you find yourself on this graph? I hope this talk has been beneficial in some way. If there's anyone here tonight that needs to request prayers from the congregation, confess a sin, or to accept Christ's invitation, please come forward now as we stand and sing.